Right. Welcome everybody. So we're going to present here creating the cutest stylized effects with geometry nodes. My name is Thierry Paalman. I'm the head of technology at Submarine, but I won't be doing most of the talking. That will be Nino, who's a 3D technical artist and has worked on the project we're presenting today. Let me first introduce the company that I'm working for, which is Submarine. Here's a little show reel to give you an idea of the kinds of series and movies that we're doing. So we're based here in the Netherlands with an animation studio, and we do, like you've seen in the little teaser trailer, we do everything. So when it comes to 2D, 3D, whatever we feel like is necessary for the project, we will take on and we'll grow the studio based on that. And then I'm going to quickly introduce Nino, or Nino's going to introduce himself.
Yes. Hello everyone. Nice to meet you. I've already met some of you on Wednesday. So it's nice to see some familiar faces. I'm an industrial design engineer as a background with a focus on emerging technology design. But I rolled into Blender very quickly when a client asked me to create a guitar stand in the shape of a wave, and I was using SolidWorks at the time. So it's not really that's well for organic shapes. So I rolled into Blender, and that's really where I stuck around with as well. I've done a lot of different things over the years as well, more of a generalist kind of approach, creating creatures, environments, architecture, and at some point I started using geometry nodes more and more in the earliest versions where it was available. And I started using it for some creations for promotional materials, for example for Diesel, which was a fun project to just use geometry nodes for. It grew into something a little bit more than a passion though. I started liking geometry so much that I created my own tools. I started creating more and more tools, and small ones like generating webs on whatever surface, generating grass, scattering it, but also things like jellyfish, procedural jellyfish, and some bigger ones as well. Like Mossify, which just hit 1,000 users, which is a lot of fun, but it's a procedural biome system, more than 10 now, with more than 150 assets that I created myself, and a lot of them are procedurally generated as well. Some bake and export tool, and I actually try to incorporate a way of baking non-printable BSDF shader setups as well, with a lot of mixed nodes, mixed shaders and stuff like that, which is still able to bake. And the latest one is StrandKit, which is a very large procedural hair library with all sorts of hairstyles. There was a lot, in my opinion, still missing. So this includes some hairstyles like afros, dreadlocks, bantu knots, stuff like that. And yeah, there we are. I also like to teach a little bit and give some tutorials on procedural workflows, geometry nodes. So yeah, over time I created a lot of different videos, just as more of a hobby than actual work.
Yeah,
This is you.
this is me. So yes, we had to make a series, or our producers came to us with making a series. It's rather difficult at the moment to get your series funded. So we had this one in development for quite a few years now. Unfortunately, that meant that we had to make it for a tiny budget. It was either just make it now for the money we can gather, or just wait another 5 years, which we didn't really feel like doing. But it was also quite a complicated thing to do for this tiny budget. So we, like the show already says, it's Pol the Pirate Mouse, so it's about a pirate mouse. That means that it will probably take place on water, and there will be lots of water effects. And it's also an adventure, so it will be moving a lot. The characters will be jumping around. They will be jumping in the water. They will be going by boats. Whatever. But we still want to create a rich world, which was in our original designs. We didn't want to forgo that. So we had to think of clever ways of solving this problem from the start, given our limited budget that we have. I can't say the budget, but just look at other 3D shows like CoComelon and like all the other kids shows in the landscape, and you might get a rough idea of like what they are doing for this budget. So this is a little clip that we like cobbled together.
Are you ready?
Yes, Captain!
Let's go and find some more treasures!
We're all champions of the river!
Huh? Oh, pirates! Follow the map!
Skip, look out! Good job I noticed it in time.
There you go. Thank you. Yeah, so it's, I just have this slide here to talk a little bit more about the project, but so we just finished it. It's going to be premiering at Cinekit next month, and then a week later on Dutch television. So if anybody here is Dutch with kids, you can watch it. So the answer to most of our like questions about budget and time and all of the richness of the world was in the end geometry nodes, and I had this feeling in the beginning. So when we started the project, I searched for a geometry nodes expert, and that's again where Nino comes in. So Nino is going to explain the highlights of this show. Basically, his geometry node setup is visible in all of the shots in the show. Sometimes often multiple geometry node setups per shot. And the main one is water. So over to you, Nino.
Thank you, Thierry. So let's have a look of some water shots that include most of the system. Once again, there's a waterfall, there's rapids going on, there's the boat interaction with the actual water, which has to work based on an animated boat, of course, which is the input for it all. We have some ripple setups going on, and we have a separate tool for the actual splashes as well. So we're going to get into that a little bit more. So there is one main kind of water setup geometry node that has over 70 inputs that you can change in the modifier section where the geometry node kind of interface lives, right? So that is basically where that lives. So it is really important that it worked with an animated boat, rigged boat, but there was also some kind of manual control. So you can still control things like the height of the splash, but also the speed that the splash particles move away from the boat. In the meantime, I'm trying to scale up this screen here a little bit. Excuse me. There we go. So, then this is what I want to get into first, the interaction with the water between the boat and the water, the splashes that come out of the water when the boat interacts with it. And the initial kind of thing that happens there is the boat wake, and that's really just a proximity mask. And I think a lot of you are familiar with the geometry proximities and how these work. But in a simulation, of course, you feed in that proximity mask every frame, and you let it fall off a little bit over time. So yeah, feed it into a simulation and mix it together properly, and you get a nice kind of setup. Now, there were a lot of masks needed, though, which was the tricky part, because we did want a kind of stylized fall off of the ripples of the water. We didn't just want to fade it out with opacity. That felt like a cheap trick to us. So we did store a lot of variables for distances to the boat on the sides, on the front, also on the back. And this is, for example, something we can control with that, which is really just the thickness of those sketched lines that we want to show on the water. For example, the front of the boat interacts with the water a little bit more. It pushes the water away stronger. The waves are usually a little bit higher. So we have bigger sketched lines there as well. The more we go away from the boat, the lines become a little bit thinner because, well, the water is more calm again, right? It's got more time to settle down. So the splash itself looks a little bit like this. So let's get into the splash, right? So like I said before, bamboo animation has to be the driver. This entire tool goes to a different team that has to work with this setup, and they have to work with an animated boat as well. So they add the boat to the water, and the water should just work based on that, with some manual control, of course. So this is basically inside of that group, and don't worry too much about the notes you see here. I kind of generalized it a little bit more to explain what's going on. So first things first, we just capture, store, and update all velocities that we need, right? Before the main simulation, there's multiple simulation zones going on, one to just, well, set the velocities properly. We then distribute some splash origins on a mesh that's not the boat, and I'll explain why later. Then we set some initial point velocities where we spawn particles, right? So we have to actually get the velocity of the boat, for example, into the particles as well, so they move with the boat and don't get left behind. Of course, we simulate those points, right? They have to actually get introduced to physics, gravity. The velocities have to actually propel them outwards from the boat. So then we convert these particles into trails with a fun little method based on, well, curves to mesh to volume to mesh to splash. And I'll explain that a little bit more later. So the input is not actually bamboo for the splash. It was a little bit unstable, so I decided to actually add a very simple mesh line around the boat that we use to just distribute points on convert this to points. Now the reason why this is not actually a curve, but a line of a mesh, is so we can use weight paint groups, and we can always convert it to a curve in the geometric system and access the tangents at that point. So this way we really could control it with a weight paint group, for example, for the height of the splash. At the center where the boat interacts the most, we have a higher splash, so we can just, well, use a little bit of weight paint there to make it higher. And then we convert it to a curve. We can use the tangents, right, the direction of the curve. We can just swap that around in the middle, so the tangents are facing away from the center point there. And together they really create that frontal split that you usually see in boats interacting with water. I refer to it as a moustache shape because it kind of looks like one. And this is really the output that you get if you apply that to your particle system. Now there is a little bit of math involved as well. There is a general equation behind the velocities of the boat primarily. I think it's the driving force behind how the particles move and how they operate. So I did list all the different terms here and what they are for you if you want to watch it back later or are interested in this. But I did just generalize it a little bit more to explain it right here. So I split this up in 5 elements, and the first one is really the boat speed, right? I want to move the particles based on how fast the boat is moving. And that also means that if the boat is traveling really slow, I want the splash to be a little bit slower as well. And if it's traveling max speed, max velocity, I want the particles to be bigger, right? So it has to be based on that boat velocity a little bit. Now there is a little bit of a drag coefficient involved there as well, because, well, the particles need to actually slow down and get left behind a little bit. We can control that. There is, of course, air resistance going on, stuff like that. So that is what we apply there as well. And then at step 2, we have some initial shape velocities. We, of course, need to have some manual control over the shape. So we use the normal direction of the hull of the boat to actually point these particles outwards, right? That was an important part. But we also use a turbulence velocity, which basically is a randomized velocity for every point, right? All the points that move out, they shouldn't just align in exactly the same direction. So there's just a little bit of randomization going on there. We, of course, have that split velocity going on that splits the wake of the boat at the front. And in step 3, we just have some regular scalars and limiters. At some point, the speed of the boat got so high that the splash would go out of control. So we just limited that, kept that at a certain value, and we can still manually scale that down and up. Then part 4 is just saying that the x and y elements of the vector velocity are scaled down with particle h, right? And that's just a more natural way water behaves, we found, or we thought, and they just move down more over time instead of out over time. Step 5 is just gravity interacting constantly with your points, dragging your points down below the actual water surface. So to get the velocity of the boat, what we did was just capturing the positions of that mesh line compared to the location of bamboo. And then when you input your animation into your simulation, you usually lose that simulation, which is perfect because then we can store the position before we do a transformation. We can store the position after we do a transformation with just the set position nodes and rotating, well, just to align it to the transformations of the boat. And then after that, we can just, with those 2 positions, calculate the velocity and the direction of the vector for that velocity as well. This is just incorporating the rest of the velocity vector from the equation that I showed you before. So I don't think it's interesting to go into too much detail there. And then we just spawn particles each frame, right? I think some of you may have gone to the live tutorial on Wednesday where they went over the particles, the class for particles. So that's really what we do here as well. We spawn particles every frame and we join new particles with a new seed, a randomized seed every frame as well. So every frame we get new particles. And then we just give it that velocity v and we set the position of the particle based on that velocity. Then we do have to convert this to actual trails, otherwise it's just one particle following a path and that's not really what we are looking for. So once again, we just add a simulation zone where we join every single particle of every frame and we end up more with an actual trail of particles moving away from the boat. Right, so how do we actually convert this into a curve? Right now it's points, we want to connect this properly into curves, right, that we can convert to mesh later. So we instance curved lines, simple curved lines with a start and an end point. We instance those on all the particles, all the points that we created before. Then to get that into proper direction so that the end point ends where the start point of the new particle begins, and we can align the rotation basically to the velocity vector, right? It already points in the correct direction. We align it to that direction and it points correctly. Then we can also just scale that entire line down based on the length of the velocity vector, which will indicate where it has to end, and then the endpoints overlap perfectly with the start point of the next particle. So then it looks something like this. Now, an important step here, and I skipped something actually, we convert it to a mesh, and then we just merge by distance, otherwise we still have single curve segments instead of connected paths. So we have to merge them together and then we convert it back to a curve. So then it looks something like this, and we can actually start trimming that curve based on particle h, so it looks like it actually dissipates over time, right? Not every splash line should stick around forever. They should disappear at some point, otherwise the scene is also going to be very heavy in terms of performance. And then we just resample based on curve length, right? To just get a nice control over how many points we have based on the length. Now, there's also some smaller particles involved, right? There's a main volume of water, the main splash, but there's some smaller particles as well. That's just some foam particles, I guess you can call it, that move away from the boat a little bit faster, and they should not interact with the main mesh. So we actually just tweak the values a little bit for that equation, right, for the nodes that are linked to the parts of those equations. So we increase velocities like the boat velocity, just manually scale that up a little bit, as well as the scaling factor for the normals of the hull, the random values, and the split values as well. And there's even an option to really control the drag coefficient a little bit. If particles decrease, they usually encounter a higher deceleration. So then we have a curved line, and we are finally in shape to convert this to something we can actually see in the 3D viewport and in the renders. And that is basically just converting your curve to a mesh with a very simple circle, right, as a profile curve. And you scale, of course, the radius of your curve based on point H as well, so you can get a nice trail shape. And then I convert this to a volume and back to a mesh, just so then we can end up with some nice connecting kind of parts of that splash. Otherwise, every single trail has its own kind of shape, and I want them to connect a bit more like water does, more like a volume does, right? So we connect it to a volume, and then we convert it back to a mesh, and everything gets connected beautifully. Now, I do also have a little bit of a smoothing iteration going on here, which is just a simple repeat zone, where I set the position based on edge vertices, right? And then I add the position 1 and position 2 of these edge vertices, and I basically scale it by 0.5 or divide it by 2 to get that midpoint between the 2 points. And if we repeat that over and over again, we can smoothen out our mesh very beautifully. And yeah, you can always change the iterations, right? How smooth do you want your splash to be? You can change that in the input of the modifier. Next up, we have a bamboo that fully interacts with your water. And bamboo is the name of the boat, by the way. I'm not sure if I've said that before already. So that is the driving force behind all water. And that's also the driving force, for example, for the river highway is what we call it, which is a large kind of river setup we designed to cover all the shots of the show. And it looks something like this if you look at it from top view. And there's things involved like a waterfall, like rapids, there's a beach section, and there's a dark forest section, so there has to be some kind of tweaks in those elements. And I think fun ones to highlight is the rapid section as well as the waterfall section, right? There's a bit of something else going on there as well, right? It's not just the water setup. So the systems in play there is really the same water foundation throughout the entire show, right? The 70 plus variable kind of node setup that I highlighted in the first slide, I think it was, is basically what we used throughout the entire show for all the water systems. Now this one though has a particle system with metaballs. Metaballs and particle system work together perfectly. I could not get it to work properly in geometry nodes. So whatever I did to import metaballs, they will never create a beautiful volume like you would with metaballs and particle systems. So if someone does know a way to do that, please come to me after this and I'd love to learn. And yeah, the rest is a geometry node simulation. There's layers for the ripple, just layering textures on top of each other, and I'll highlight that a little bit more in the waterfall as well. So the waterfall is the same stuff, but just over-exaggerated a little bit, right? There's a lot of layering going on in the waterfall itself to give it that depth perception. But it basically uses custom splash meshes instead of using the normals, for example, for the boat that we used before to direct the splashes away from the boat. We now just use a mesh with a set custom normal that we can just rotate in every direction that we want ourselves. So that just takes away a little bit of the trouble of sampling that from, for example, a boat. There's a little bit of extra bubbles going on here, some extra layering. And for example, for the waterfall, what we did is the layers that are more on the back. It is just one 2D plane, but I'm calling it layers because they are lower opacity and move slower. That makes it look like it's water that is kind of behind the main layer. And then we move to a little bit of that layering. I did want to highlight just the masks involved here to give you an idea of how that operates. And you can see, for example, under that rock at the top, there's some more going on there, some more disruptions in the water, some more things moving down in kind of a fun manner. So for the actual splash effects, there's a separate tool. Something that we can just import into a scene where we need a splash, and you can make it work like that. Now, we did that with 5 separate elements, and there are some other challenges involved here, like the timings of everything, as well as the start frame. Start frame is not that challenging after all, but the timings are really tricky to get right, especially if there's a CG supervisor who is going through every single frame, checking if that single frame looks nice. So everything has to be timed perfectly there. So this is what that setup looks like. Now the left part, all the blue stuff you see are math nodes, right? They are used to control all of these timings. I'll show it a bit closer up later, so don't worry about that too much yet. But because we already handled the splash a little bit more in detail, I wanted to focus a bit more on actually tooling this, right? Because it was very necessary that people who are using this after me are also able to set up a splash and set up cool looking scenes without going into all of the nodes and having to change things in your node system. So how can people use this after me is a very, very good question to ask yourself if you're setting up a tool. And those people are usually blanco. They haven't worked on that tool for weeks, so really try to dial that down to beginner levels. So there are some customized inputs in, of course, the modifier panel for that, right? You can expose all the variables that you want, and that includes, for example, in this case, the shape, right? You can create a custom shape with just a guide curve, and that will create your splash. You can set your custom velocities, you can set your custom scales, and so forth. So this is all managed in that modifier input. Now, just in case, there's always some tutorials included, right? That's what we did for this show. If we created something that may give some issues later on, or something that just has to work in a certain way, we will include tutorials about how exactly to use that tool and what you can actually do with it, right? That's an important factor here as well. So this is really what a modifier looked like. So what I always try to do is at the very top of the modifier, I'll list all the elements that are required for the tool to work. So I won't hide those away in a panel, I won't hide those away at the bottom, of course, but just have them at the top, so those are the first things that the other people see. So they can enable things, they can change things, but they can customize whatever they want. And then after that, you can add segments for all the individual kind of design elements, like the outer splash, there's an inner splash, there's a ripple section. So I'll list those all in their own individual segments, so it all becomes nice and adjustable. So for example, for the inner splash, we have things like randomization seeds, right? Every splash should look somewhat different. You can change the radius, which is a huge driving force behind the entire kind of setup. If you change one main radius slider, your entire splash will scale up or down, and everything will be linked to that main slider. That's also why there are so many math nodes involved. And then we create a tool, right? We add some arrows that they can enable to really see how that splash direction goes. They can already tell where the splash is going before they have to actually simulate it, right? That always helps. And you can just tweak parameters and your entire splash will based on that. And it's actually quite fast as well. It doesn't take minutes to wait, it's seconds. So there's one control section that controls all the elements, and you can tweak the values based on the splash radius. Like I said before, the main radius is 1. If we have a smaller character, you just want to scale that to, for example, a half, and all the elements like the size of your splash, the actual radius of the individual particles, and the height of the splash, so the velocity that those particles move out, it should all change based on the size of the character and the mass of the character that's involved as well. So yeah, we added some visual feedback like the arrows, and we still allow shape customization if needed, right? I love automation, but there should always be some manual tweaks that you can do to really just align this to your scene. So yeah, and at that point, really creating splashes becomes fun. You'll start playing around with different objects, different sizes, you'll test the limits and what you can do, what you can't do, and then you end up with a fun tool that you can use throughout the entire show. So a custom simulation start time, I just wanted to highlight that in case there's some people wondering about it. I just built in a very simple switch that only inputs the simulation data if it's true, if a certain frame has been met with a custom value that you set. And if that value is not met, it will just input the node before the simulation, and that really just settles that. So then I just want to highlight the ripple element because it gave me a lot of pain during the entire process. It was based on the splash, of course. It has to be based on the same parameters. The splash and the ripples created by the splash, they go hand in hand a lot. So this is basically just storing attributes, and a lot of attributes, and I named these test 1, test 2, test 3, whatever, just because, well, it was so much iteration going on to really get that right. So for example, that is for the start frames as well. So at what frame those ripples should actually fade in, when they should fade out. And the ripple should, of course, fade in from the center, and it's not just a very simple opacity slider, right, that will fade it in and out, but it actually should fade in from the center and also dissipate from the center. There should be some bubbles that pop up, right, from the character. So things like that is just based on the geometry node attributes. So we managed to create the scalability. It was challenging, but we did it with a lot of tweaking, iterations, using math nodes, multiplications, and at some point even that didn't work. So we had to actually mix it together with custom values if certain thresholds are met. But it works, right? So it works, for example, like this, where you have your characters falling into the water. The Pol, our main character, the mouse there, has a bit of a bigger splash, and the only variable that we had to change, for example, for Robin, the smaller bird, is just the main radius of the splash, and everything else is procedurally adjusted there. Then we also had a little bit of a desire we wanted, which is stepped animation for the water effects, but we didn't want to do it really in post. We wanted to do it in Blender itself, in 3D itself, in the geometry nodes itself. But we didn't end up doing it in the geometry nodes, but we did end up doing it in a way where it works. I'll highlight that after this. So this is just slowed down, so you can see that the characters are just moving every frame. The water moves every 2 frames. And we managed to do that with the simulation of that splash and editing it with a small script, a small add-on that really just creates a backup of your data, of your cache data. So you have blobs and meta files, and it will just create a nice backup of all of that in case you mess something up. It happens a lot. Then it goes over the directories, all the directories that you've added in the add-on, and it will actually just copy all the data from one frame onto the next. So every set of 2 frames share the exact same data. That will keep all your simulation stuff working, right? You don't have to rebake, you don't have to do anything, and it will work perfectly. Now it will also just store the state, right? Is this a stepped version or a normal version? And you can switch back and forth between the 2 in case you want to switch back to your smooth animation. So yeah, how does that work? Well, this is just a cube that I move in the Z direction with a fixed offset every frame in the simulation zone. I bake it out, I run the script. Is it working? Yes. Where you set your directories and you just create it, restart it, and you end up with a nice stepped animation. It works on whatever cache you have, how many caches you have, so you don't even have to worry about that one. We did make this available for you for free. If you're interested in stepped simulation, stepped animations, scan it and you'll be able to just get it. Some people scanning, I'll wait for a second. Still some people going. All right, I think that's everyone. So then there's also a separate tool for the ripple effects. Now we have a main mesh for the water, but that's a large mesh and we did not want to give it too much detail. It was very high demanding for the performance. So we created a separate tool for that we wanted to overlay on the actual water mesh. So it's a separate mesh that we snap to the water surface, and it stores the masks the same way as Bamboo, right, within a simulation zone with geometry proximity going on. This works for object and armature-driven animations, which is, of course, well, armature-driven animations is what we have the most, of course. And this is basically what that overlay looks like, right? So it really is just an overlay of color and bump going on. So to get that bump working properly, we did have to, we did need a very small kind of opacity going on there, otherwise those bumps will just not show up properly on that mesh. So there's a very slight opacity going on there, but once you add it onto your actual water, that really doesn't matter anymore, and everything will blend together beautifully. Now I did get to the section where I want to highlight some bonus tools. So we are here for water primarily, but there's some water geometry node setups used in the show as well that I think is very, very fun to highlight here. The first one is we have a lot of objects that we scatter onto the ground, like rocks. That there was a lot of rocks going on. And we just want to fix that harsh transition, right? The transition between two materials, but also the transition between normals. Now there's one setup where we just transfer normals, but in Blender 4.5 there's a geometry node that does that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there. But we also created a setup where we added some brush stroke effects that cover those edges, and also an automated instance-based blending, right? We used a lot of scattering of rocks, and we didn't really want to manually place all the blending everywhere and tweak the variables, so we created a nice automated system for that as well. So this is pretty much what that first system looks like, where we blend it together beautifully with some brush strokes. Right, and you can fully customize how high that goes, how high your texture has to go up, how many brush strokes you want, how wide you want them to be. But this didn't really work when we had environments with tons and tons of rocks. So we designed a new system for those instances. They look slightly different, but they still work up quite well in the environment, and they even work up quite well up close, as these rocks are blended quite naturally with the ground. So how we did that is by accessing the actual scatter setup of the rocks. So you can see a tiny little red or pink node setup there in between that really takes care of all the blending going on between the rocks and the ground. So we did this by spawning instances on the points, right? Spawning circles on the rock points, the instance points, and, well, giving them the same scale and rotation as the instances they have to blend with, right? So here's how that looks. I hope you can see the circles. I think so. So we add those circles at the rocks, and then we just set that curve to the rocks and to the ground, and we repeat over this, right? We start by just shrink wrapping it to the ground with a set position based on geometry proximity, but with a tiny little bit of a Z offset, so it never really touches the ground. And then the step after is to just shrink wrap it to the rocks, right? And we repeat that over and over again, as many iterations as you really need. And that will result in a curve line that is shrink wrapped beautifully and smoothly around your individual rocks. So here is what that looks like if we crank up the iterations for those curve lines. I hope you can see it properly. I think so. It smoothens it out a little bit. And then we just curve to mesh once again, right, with a curve line, a very simple curve line in this case. And we set the endpoints of those lines to the ground floor, and we again shrink wrap that to the ground surface. So that really gives us a nice kind of blending layer that just works for all the rocks, no manual kind of tweaking needed. Then we also used hair systems, not for hair, but for actual leaves, right? We used the geometry node hair system because we had quite an art-directed flow of leaves on specific trees. So the easiest way we thought of to set that up is with a groom system. All right, you can groom everything nicely with a comb in the direction where you want it to be. And then we can just use that to spawn leaves, align the rotations of those leaves to the groom direction, and it really works beautifully. Now we did blend these leaves with the main texture by just sampling the UV map, which, well, for example, gives us results like this, where you have a main tree with a lot of leaves that we art directed nicely around those kind of ball segments, but they also blend nicely with the tree. There's nothing too harsh going on there. They're also used for the bushes in the background, for the red bush on the side, and for all the trees pretty much in the background as well. So that looks a little bit like this. Now there was kind of a challenge going on here because we had a nice kind of art style for the leaves where highlight areas of an object had different leaf textures than shadow areas. So it's not all the same set of leaf textures. It depends on where the light hits, and that spot needs a specific set of textures, as well as the shadow areas, for example. So we set that up based on normals of the mesh. All right? It's not always exactly the same direction as your light input, but it is usually the case that normals facing down get less light, right? It's natural. So this is a little bit of tooling once again, how that looks. So you can still just groom all your leaves in directions where you really want them to be. You can change all the parameters that you want to change, like the scale of the leaf. There's even a nice kind of section where you can still change the highlight color of the leaves, which is very, very efficient when we transfer this to a different tree, for example. And it works beautifully, and we use that for the entire river highway, for example, too, where all our trees have leaves that blend properly with the mesh. And for the bush of Pasha as well, was a little bit more difficult to set up because the leaves were a lot longer. But if you make your hair longer as well, you can just properly align that too. Lastly, I want to go into the ivy. So it's along the entire river. We wanted ivy climbing up trees, and we didn't want to do it manually. So once again, we have an automated system. Of course, randomized for each tree. So here's a little bit of how that looks. So we have a bit of climbing going on, a lot of variables we can set ourselves. Of course, a probability input, so where should they be and where shouldn't they be. Not every tree needs ivy, it gets oversaturated. And that's really just based on spawning spirals on instance points. And those spirals get a natural feel of ivy. Some go in one direction and others go in the other direction. And they have a little bit of a different kind of, what's it called? How many rotations it has. Everything is slightly randomized. So we spawn the spirals, we shrink wrap it to the tree in a smooth way, right? We do a little bit more smoothing. We move the endpoints a little bit away from the trees. We spawn sub-branches, curved lines on the actual spirals, and we make sure that we move them away from the actual tree so they can't rotate towards the tree. And yeah, you can really just see that in the background through the entire river highway. There's trees with ivy, but also in other scenes, for example, the swamp area where you can see the ivy in the background, and you can also see we used blending here for the ground with the rocks in like a swampy kind of way. And then we get to Cherry once again. Got you by surprise there.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm here to do the submarine promotion again. So if anybody is nodding along and thinks like this all makes sense and wants to work at Submarine, you can scan this QR code and it'll bring you to an email link. Any skills, welcome. We're often recruiting for new Blender people, all kinds of talents. So please just send an email. We'll put you on the list. Also, a bit of promotion for Nino. Of course, he does a lot of YouTube tutorials, has a lot of plugins. If you scan this QR code, you'll find his link tree and all of the links there to direct him to the marketplaces. And that was it for today. If there's any questions, we'll be around later. You guys can come over. Thank you all.